Settle in and let the room get a little quieter than it has any right to be. Somewhere nearby, a motor turns with a steady, patient hum, like a fan that never learned how to sleep. You might think this is a place of heroic space dreams, all clean glass and bright certainty. But you are wrong in a gentler way. This is a centrifuge room, and it is mostly metal, paperwork, and the slow business of finding the limit. Tonight, with the Sleepless Scientist keeping you company, you will listen as gravity gets turned up, one careful notch at a time. You will feel how the body grows heavy, how vision politely dims at the edges, and how breathing becomes deliberate and measured. Not as a panic story, as a quiet inventory of what it cost for someone else, so you can rest. The first truth is simple, and it is not glamorous. They built a long arm, they put a seat on the end, and they spun you around like laundry. If the arm is long enough and the spin is fast enough, your body feels heavier. Not emotionally heavier, although that can happen too. Physically heavier, like gravity has decided you have been too cheerful lately. In the centrifuge, you are not flying upward. You are being pulled sideways, over and over, into a curve you cannot see. Your inner ear tries to write a report about it. The report is mostly complaints. In early high-G research, the room rarely looked like a cathedral of science. It looked like a workshop that got promoted too quickly. Paint that has seen better decades. Bolts that have been tightened, loosened, and tightened again. Clipboards with coffee rings and a pencil tied on a string, like it might escape. And you, the most delicate instrument in the building, strapped in with all the optimism they could afford. You might imagine the test subject as a perfectly selected astronaut, but many of the early subjects were pilots, students, engineers, and volunteers with that particular mix of curiosity and poor foresight. Sometimes it was the same small group, again and again, because they were available and they already knew what the ride did to a person. You are here because a question has teeth. How much acceleration can a human tolerate while still seeing, breathing, and making decisions that matter? Because out in the real world, high G is not a laboratory novelty. It happens when an aircraft turns hard or pulls up fast, or when a rocket decides it is done being polite, and the body, which evolved to walk and nap and complain about weather, has to cope. So you sit down in the seat, and it is narrower than you want. The harness goes across your shoulders and hips, firm and unromantic. Your head rests against something padded, pretending to be kind. A microphone is near your mouth because they want your words as much as your pulse. You will be asked to read numbers and respond and squeeze a trigger and say when something changes, because the body fails in a pattern, and patterns can be measured. The operator's voice comes through a speaker, calm and practiced. They tell you the plan in small steps because people are easier to handle in small steps. The motor deepens its hum, and the arm begins to move. At first, it feels like nothing important, just motion, like a slow carousel that refuses to play music. Then the spin builds, and your body starts to argue with itself. Your stomach says you are turning, and your eyes say the room is stable, and your brain does what it always does. It tries to negotiate a truce. The truce does not hold for long. The key idea is acceleration. When you move in a circle, you are constantly changing direction. Changing direction is a form of acceleration, even if your speed stays the same. Your mass resists that change, and the seat supplies the force that keeps you turning. That force presses into you, and you press back, and in your bones, it becomes a new kind of weight. This is why it is called high G. G is the familiar pull you live with every day, the one that keeps your coffee in the cup. In the centrifuge, they add more of it in a direction that turns your body into a reluctant river. Early researchers wanted to know where the river floods, not in poetry, in physiology. What happens to your blood, to your eyes, to your lungs, to your ability to think? Because an aircraft does not care about your mythology. It cares whether you can keep flying it. The spin climbs, and now you begin to feel the first honest sensation. Your arms are still yours, but they are farther away than usual. Your legs feel as if they have been filled with warm sand. You could move them, yes, but each movement has a price tag. This is the part people often get wrong when they imagine high G. They picture a brave grin, clenched teeth, dramatic music. But most of the time, it is quieter. It is like trying to get comfortable under too many blankets. Except the blankets are being added by a machine, and the machine does not get bored. As the G load rises, blood becomes a problem with gravity in it. Blood is heavy, and it is obedient to physics. Your heart is a pump, and it is good, but it is not magical. Under normal gravity, it pushes blood upward to your brain without too much drama. Under high G, the blood wants to stay low. It pools in the legs and abdomen because that is the downhill direction now. Your brain, up top, starts to receive less of what it expects, less pressure, less flow, less oxygen delivery, even if the air is fine. And the brain, being a high-maintenance tenant, responds by dimming the lights. But you do not start with darkness. You start with heaviness, the kind that makes your jaw feel stubborn, the kind that makes your tongue feel like it is wearing a coat. You try to speak into the microphone, and your own voice sounds slightly delayed, not because time has changed, because effort has. Your chest begins to notice itself. Breathing is usually an unconscious luxury. Under high G, it becomes an action. The muscles between your ribs have to lift more than they are used to lifting. Your diaphragm, that broad sheet of muscle, has to push against organs that now feel heavier too. You are not suffocating, not yet, but every breath becomes deliberate, like sipping air through fabric. And the absurd part is that the room is perfectly safe, in the way laboratories like to be. There are monitors. There are doctors or technicians nearby watching lines on screens. There are rules about how fast to increase the G and when to stop. There is a checklist, and it is treated like scripture. And still, the main experiment is you, a soft animal, doing its best inside a hard machine. In the early days, they were still learning what to ask for. They tried different positions, upright and reclined. They tried different tasks, like reading instruments or pushing buttons in sequence. They listened to what subjects reported, because the first signs of trouble are often subjective. A feeling, a narrowing, a strange calm that arrives at the wrong time. Your body is heavy now, and you discover a small cruelty. High G does not just press you into the seat. It presses everything inside you downward. Your cheeks sag slightly. Your eyelids feel thick. The skin on your forehead seems to slide in slow motion toward your eyebrows. It is not painful. It is simply insistent. You try to lift a hand, and it rises a few centimeters, then stops, as if the air has become thick syrup. You could force it higher if you wanted, but you learn quickly that force is expensive. Energy, oxygen, coordination, all of it starts to feel like it is on rationing. In the early centrifuge rooms, they were trying to draw a map. At 2G, 3G, 4G, what happens first and what happens next? The map was not just for curiosity, it was for survival. Because pilots were already experiencing these loads in tight turns, and aircraft were getting faster and stronger and more capable of asking the human body to do unreasonable things. The room keeps humming, steady as a lullaby for engineers. You are pressed down, and your thoughts become slightly simpler, not stupid, just narrowed, like the world has fewer open tabs. This is another quiet thing people do not expect. Under stress, cognition becomes a smaller room. You focus on the immediate task. Because the brain is conserving, it is not being noble. It is being practical. You are asked to read a dial. The numbers are clear. For now, you say them aloud and you hear yourself. And it is comforting in a plain way. A human voice proving you are still here. Then the G rises another notch and the heaviness deepens. It feels like someone has placed a hand on your chest, firm and patient, not choking you, just reminding you that you are made of mass. Your legs are now unquestionably heavy, not tired heavy, a weight that does not care about rest. In this condition, even a small movement can drain you. If you were to reach for something, your shoulder muscles would have to fight not only the object, but your own arm, your own blood, your own skin. All of it becomes something to lift. This is where early research starts to become a little bleak. Because the limits are not heroic, they are mechanical. You have a certain blood pressure, a certain heart output, a certain tolerance before the brain decides it is no longer worth keeping the visual system online. And the visual system, being polite, usually gives you warnings, not alarms. Warnings. At this stage, you might notice your peripheral vision changing. Not a dramatic tunnel yet, more like the edges have lost interest. Colors feel slightly less saturated. The world looks as if someone lowered the contrast. This is not because your eyes are bored. It is because the retina and the brain are not receiving the same steady supply. Your eyes are hungry tissue, and they are used to being fed on schedule. High G disrupts the schedule. The technical term people often use is G-induced loss of consciousness. It sounds clinical, which is a kind word for it. Before loss of consciousness, there are stages that come like dusk. Gray out, when vision becomes washed and pale. Blackout, when vision is gone, but you might still be awake. And then, sometimes, full loss of consciousness, when the brain simply checks out for a moment. Not forever, just long enough to be disastrous in a cockpit. In the centrifuge, it is data. In the sky, it is a hole in the day. You can feel the approach if you are paying attention. At first, it is subtle, a sense that looking sideways takes effort, that the corners of the room are retreating. The instrument panel is still there, but it feels farther away, as if your eyes are looking through a narrow tube. You blink, and the blink lasts a fraction longer than you intended. You keep talking because they want your report, and you want to prove you are still functional. There is a strange social pressure in being a test subject. Even if nobody says it out loud, you feel it. You do not want to be the person who quits early. You do not want to be dramatic. So you describe it calmly. You say, "My vision is dimming at the edges." You say, "Colors are fading." You say it like you are discussing weather. Because in a laboratory, that is what your body becomes. A weather system. Pressure changes, flow changes, visibility changes, and the people outside the machine are meteorologists with clipboards. The centrifuge continues, and now the heaviness is more than sensation. It is behavior. Your breathing becomes shallower unless you actively correct it. Your neck muscles work to keep your head positioned because your head has weight too, and it would like to slump. Your jaw wants to hang open just a little because closing it takes tone. Even swallowing is a conscious act now, as if your throat has been asked to lift a heavier object. If you were in a normal chair, you would shift your posture. In this seat, you are strapped, and posture becomes whatever the harness permits. Early researchers learned quickly that posture matters. If you sit upright, the blood has a longer climb to your brain. If you recline, the climb is shorter, and tolerance often improves. This is why later aircraft and spacecraft seats tend to angle backward, not because it looks cool, because it helps keep you conscious. Aesthetics follows physiology. Eventually, after enough unpleasant trials, your vision is now in that gray territory. Not gone, but muted. The world looks like an old photograph left in sunlight. You can still read the dial if you focus, but focusing is another cost. Your brain is choosing where to spend its remaining clarity. You might notice something else too. Your hearing stays normal. Your sense of touch stays normal. It is vision that complains first, because vision is expensive. It takes a lot of processing, and it depends on reliable blood flow. So the body begins there, trimming the budget. The operator asks for a response, and you give it. Your tongue moves, slow but accurate. You are still awake, but your world is narrowing. There is an odd calm that can appear here. Not because you are brave, because your brain is running low on oxygen and the emotional circuits get quiet. People describe it as dreamy, detached, almost pleasant, which is unsettling because it is the wrong time to feel pleasant. Congratulations, your body has found a way to make danger feel like a nap. This is why training became important. Not just muscle training, but awareness training, learning the early signs before the calm arrives. Because once the calm arrives, you might not care enough to fix it. In the early days, they were still building that vocabulary. They asked subjects to report sensations in their own words. Curtain, coming down. Tunnel, sparkles. Some described a shimmering at the edges, like heat haze on asphalt. Others saw stars, tiny points, because the retina was being deprived and misfiring. Your body, under stress, generates its own little planetarium. You are still pressed into the seat. The motor is still patient. The paperwork is still waiting. And this is where the centrifuge becomes a kind of quiet theater, because the main event is invisible. It is pressure gradients and blood vessels and valves doing their best, arteries trying to keep flow upward, veins expanding and holding more blood in the lower body, the heart rate rising because the heart senses the drop in pressure up top and tries to compensate. The body has reflexes for this, built-in, ancient, baroreceptors, pressure sensors in the arteries, sending signals to adjust, tighten vessels, speed up the heart, maintain flow. It works up to a point. And then the physics wins, because physics does not get tired. You reach a moment where the world is almost entirely gray, not black, just dim, like a room lit by a hallway bulb. You can still speak. You can still hear the operator. You can still feel the harness. But your eyes are no longer reliable narrators. And that, in a cockpit, is where mistakes are born. The first mistake is thinking your eyes are failing because your eyes are weak. They are not weak. They are simply downstream from a brain that is quietly being underfilled. Your retina is greedy tissue, and it wants oxygen like a spoiled aristocrat wants velvet. When the blood pressure in your head drops, the retina stops being generous with detail. It does not announce this with sirens. It just stops paying for the edges of the picture. In the centrifuge, that dimness is information. In a fighter turn, it is how a perfectly good airplane becomes a lawn dart. You try to keep reading the dial anyway, not because it is wise, because you are human, and humans keep doing the task until the task stops being possible. The operator asks you to call out numbers, and you do. Slower now. You notice that your voice still works, and that feels unfair. Your mouth can report a world you can barely see. This is blackout before blackout, a narrowing, a dimming, a slow, polite eviction from your own visual cortex. The technical story is a tug-of-war between heart and gravity. Gravity is not clever. It just never stops. Your heart responds by beating faster and squeezing harder. Your blood vessels tighten, especially in your lower body, trying to push blood upward. Baroreceptors, those little pressure sensors, are sending frantic messages like an office group chat during a fire drill. Increase heart rate, constrict vessels, maintain mean arterial pressure. Your body is full of feedback loops, and they are all trying to keep you conscious. And they mostly succeed until the math gets rude. Because high G is not a feeling. It is a pressure gradient. Your blood has weight, and now it has extra weight. The distance from your heart to your brain becomes a hill that keeps getting steeper. So the brain compromises. It shuts down the fancy parts first. Peripheral vision, fine color, then eventually vision entirely. Often you are still awake when the screen goes dark. That is the part people find unsettling later. You can speak, you can think, you can hear, and yet your world is gone. It is like someone turned off the monitor while the computer keeps running. I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request. But the computer is not really running well. It is running on emergency power, and it is cutting corners you cannot see. Your thoughts still feel like thoughts, but they come from a smaller shelf. Simple words stay available, and complicated ones hide in the back. In early experiments, they learned this the awkward way. They would ask you to do math, or track a moving needle, or remember a short sequence, and you would insist you were doing fine. Then the recording would show you were confidently wrong, not because you were dishonest, because your brain, half-fed, loves a story where it is still in control. This is the quiet danger of hypoxia, low oxygen delivery. It does not always feel like suffocation. It can feel like mild confidence, arriving early and staying late. And if you are unlucky, you will feel calm right before you fail. So you sit there, eyes useless, voice still working. You report what you can. You say, "I cannot see." You say it in the same tone as, "I dropped my pen." The operator acknowledges it, marks the time, and decides what happens next. In the centrifuge, they can ease off gently. In a real aircraft, easing off is something you must do yourself. That is why this room exists, not to torture volunteers, to turn panic into procedure while the stakes are still paperwork. As the G-load relaxes, your vision usually returns in reverse order. First a faint glow, then shapes, then color, then edges. It is like dawn, except dawn comes with a headache behind the eyes. Blood pressure in your head recovers. The retina stops improvising. The visual cortex stops rationing. And you realize how much effort you were spending just to remain awake. You might feel embarrassed, for no good reason. Many subjects did. Being alive is rarely dignified, and being studied makes it worse. Your heart is still pounding because it had been working overtime. Your legs feel swollen and far away, full of pooled blood and heavy warmth. Your mouth is dry, not from fear, but from breathing in a more shallow, deliberate way. Some people get a dull ache in the neck from holding the head steady. Some get a faint nausea, the inner ear filing a complaint about being spun. I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request. And sometimes the nausea is not even from the speed. It is from the argument between your eyes and your inner ear, a bureaucratic dispute with no winner. Your semicircular canals, those little fluid loops in your skull, are trying to measure rotation. But the centrifuge is polite about it, because you are strapped into a fixed seat, so the rotation is mostly the room, not your head turning on its own. That helps a little. It also makes the whole experience feel unfairly normal, like being punished by a very organized amusement park. You learn quickly that the worst part is not always the peak. The worst part is the transition. When the G-load rises, your body scrambles to adapt. When it falls, your body scrambles again in the opposite direction. Blood that pooled low starts to rush back upward. The vessels that were clamped tight begin to loosen, a little too slowly. Some people feel lightheaded even as the machine is being kind again. Congratulations, you have survived the dangerous part, and now you feel weird anyway. The technicians outside do not take it personally. They have seen this exact expression on faces before. It is a look that says, "I would like to be a mammal on the ground now." You are not done though, because they did not bring you here to spin you once and applaud. They brought you here to understand the whole sequence, from fine to failing. So the questions keep coming, calm and repetitive. Can you read the dial again? Can you squeeze the switch when the light changes? Can you say your name, your date of birth, and the last thing you ate? These are not philosophical questions. They are cognitive probes, simple enough to survive stress. Early high-G research loved simple tasks because complex tasks are hard to score. But a missed light, a delayed response, a slurred word, those are clean little data points. And you, the soft animal in the seat, are producing them on schedule. The real enemy is not only fainting. The real enemy is almost fainting while still trying to function. Because in that state, you are awake enough to commit to bad decisions. Aviation medicine learned this lesson the hard way. A pilot does not need to be unconscious to lose the fight. They only need to be slow and certain and slightly wrong. That is why the lab cares about gray out and blackout. Those are warnings, and warnings are where training can live. In the early days, the warning signs were not standardized. One subject would call it dimming. Another would call it tunnel vision. Another would insist nothing happened and then fail the task anyway. So researchers began to describe it more precisely, like cataloging weather. Peripheral vision fades first, color drains next. Central vision becomes a stubborn little circle. Then the circle collapses into nothing. Sometimes while you are still speaking, you learn to fear the quiet confidence that comes with it. Because if you feel strangely fine, you might be closer to failure than you think. That confidence is not courage. It is oxygen debt collecting interest. Your brain is a power-hungry organ. It is only a small fraction of your mass, but it burns a huge fraction of your fuel. It wants a steady stream of oxygen and glucose, delivered like room service. High G interrupts the delivery, and the brain responds like a hotel guest who cannot reach the front desk. It stops using the nice towels. It stops turning on all the lights. It closes off hallways you did not even know you had. Then, if things keep getting worse, it simply locks the door and goes quiet. You might wonder why the body does not just raise blood pressure and solve it. It tries. Your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight wiring, fires off signals. Heart rate increases, vessels constrict, especially in the lower body. But the pressure you need at the brain rises with the G load. The higher the G, the steeper the hill. Your heart is strong, but it is not designed to win a contest against an indifferent machine. So the researchers start looking for ways to cheat. Not in the sense of lying, in the sense of using anatomy against physics. If you cannot make the heart infinitely stronger, you can at least make the blood less eager to fall. That is where posture becomes science, not comfort. If you sit upright, the distance from heart to brain is tall. If you recline, the distance shrinks. The pressure gradient becomes less brutal. That is why later high-performance aircraft pushed pilots into reclined seats. It was not luxury. It was an admission of defeat, carefully upholstered. And then there is the next trick, the one that feels the most ridiculous. You fight G by squeezing yourself like toothpaste. It sounds like a joke. It is one of the most important human techniques ever developed for not passing out in a turn. At first, subjects discovered it accidentally. They would tense their legs in discomfort and notice they could see longer. They would clench their abdomen and feel less dimming. Soon it became deliberate, a maneuver, trained and timed, not a random grimace. You tighten the muscles in your calves, thighs, and buttocks. You brace your abdomen like someone is about to poke you. You are trying to compress the big blood reservoirs in the lower body. If you can keep blood from pooling there, you keep more for the brain. This is not mystical. It is plumbing with a human face. The name for it evolved over time, but the idea is simple. A strain maneuver coordinated with breathing. to maintain pressure in the upper body. The breathing part matters because breath changes pressure inside your chest. When you exhale against a closed glottis, you raise pressure in the thorax. That can help keep blood pressure up near the heart. But you cannot just hold your breath forever. If you do, carbon dioxide builds up, and you add a new problem. So the technique becomes rhythmic, a cycle of short, forced breaths timed with muscle strain. It looks ridiculous from the outside. From the inside, it feels like doing isometric exercise while someone sits on you. In the lab, they would teach you a version of it. They would listen to your breathing through the microphone. They would correct your timing, because timing is everything. Strain too late, and the dimming has already started. Strain too hard, and you fatigue early. And then you are worse off. Strain without breathing, and you trade fainting for suffocation. Congratulations, you are learning a skill that is basically controlled suffering. This is where high-G experiments stop being passive. You are no longer just enduring. You are actively managing your own physiology. The machine pushes. You push back, not with strength, but with technique. It becomes a strange dance, a negotiation with gravity. And because humans love to externalize effort, they started building suits. Not sleek superhero suits, more like wearable pressure devices designed by people who think comfort is optional. The basic anti-G suit is a set of bladders around the legs and abdomen. When G increases, the suit inflates. It squeezes the lower body like a blood pressure cuff that never stops hugging. This reduces the amount of blood that can pool in the legs. It also keeps the veins from expanding too much, which helps maintain return flow to the heart. The earliest versions were crude. Hoses, valves, stiff fabric, and a feeling of being grabbed by an angry octopus. But they worked enough to matter. The suit does not replace the pilot. It supports the pilot like scaffolding around a building that insists on swaying. It gives you a few more seconds of usable vision, a few more seconds of decision-making. In a fight or a low-altitude maneuver, seconds are not a bonus. They are the difference between landing and impact. In the centrifuge, the suit changes the whole mood. Without it, you feel the blood leaving your head early. With it, the heaviness is still there, but your vision holds on longer. You feel the squeeze around your thighs, firm and unromantic. It is not pleasant, but it is effective. It is a machine assisting a machine because your body is a machine too, just poorly documented. Researchers loved this because it made the human more predictable. Predictability is comfort in a lab, but suits brought new issues. Inflate too fast, and you feel pain in the groin and abdomen. Inflate unevenly, and you get strange pooling and discomfort. Fit matters because bodies vary and fabric does not forgive. Early suits could pinch nerves, restrict movement, and make it harder to reach controls. Congratulations, you can stay conscious, and now you cannot bend properly. And still, the suit plus the maneuver plus the seat angle became a system, a layered defense against physics. In the quiet language of aviation medicine, you were increasing G tolerance. In the human language of the seat, you were buying time before the world went dark. Now, as the centrifuge spins again, the operator asks you to try the strain. You do it, and it feels absurdly intimate, like flexing every muscle in your lower half for an audience. Your thighs harden, your abdomen tightens, Your breath becomes short, forced, and patterned. You can hear it in the microphone, a rhythmic grunt that nobody will describe as dignified. But the dial stays readable longer. The edges still dim but slower. The tunnel narrows with reluctance now. This is the part that makes the lab feel less like punishment, because you can learn something in real time. Your body can adapt, not by growing new organs, but by using what it has better. Of course, adaptation has a cost. The maneuver is tiring. The muscles burn, not from running, but from staying clenched. Your jaw tightens. Your neck stiffens. You are fighting gravity with your own circulation. And circulation is not free. The heart still works harder. The vessels still constrict. The blood is still heavy. All you have done is resist the pooling for a little longer. But a little longer is sometimes the whole point. Early high-G experiments were full of these small victories, not dramatic breakthroughs, just incremental survival. A new strap position, a different recline angle, a better fitting bladder in the suit, a more efficient breathing rhythm. And because the lab is what it is, every improvement gets translated into numbers. Time to gray out, time to black out, peak G sustained, heart rate response, recovery time. You, the person, become a row in a table. The table becomes a policy. The policy becomes a training program. And someday, far from this dim room, someone will keep consciousness in a violent turn because of your uncomfortable afternoon. But tonight, you are still in the chair, and the chair does not care about gratitude. The next part is the breathing, the thing you only notice when it stops being easy. Under increasing G, your chest wall becomes heavy. Your diaphragm must push down against organs that now press back harder. Your ribs must lift against weight that did not exist last week. It can feel like inhaling through a winter coat. The air is there, but your mechanics are compromised. This is why oxygen systems became so important in high-performance flight. Not just to provide oxygen at altitude, to provide pressure and support breathing under load, because even if the air contains plenty of oxygen, the body still has to move it. And under high G, moving air costs more. Early experiments separated these problems carefully. Is the subject failing because oxygen content is low, or because blood cannot reach the brain, or because breathing mechanics are too heavy, or because all three are quietly cooperating? The answer, inconveniently, is often all three, in different proportions. So the lab would vary conditions. Different oxygen mixtures, different pressure levels, different seat angles, different durations. Some tests were short spikes simulating a sudden pull-up. Some were sustained loads simulating a long turn. The sustained ones were the cruelest in a quiet way. A short spike is drama. A sustained load is fatigue. And fatigue is where technique breaks down. Your strain maneuver degrades when your muscles tire. Your breathing rhythm slips when your chest is working overtime. Your awareness dulls when the brain is underfed for too long. That is why time matters. Not just peak G. A human can endure a lot briefly. Endurance is harder when the machine asks you to hold it. The lab also noticed something else. People vary. Some subjects gray out early. Some hold on longer for reasons that are not always obvious. Fitness helps, but not always the way you want. Blood volume matters. Vascular tone matters. Leg muscle mass matters because muscle can compress veins more effectively. Hydration matters because low fluid volume makes pressure harder to maintain. Even sleep matters because a tired nervous system responds differently. So the lab becomes personal, whether it wants to or not. You bring your whole life into the chair with you. What you ate, how much water you drank, how anxious you are, how stubborn you are, how well you learned the maneuver. And the scientists, cynical in their own way, try to turn that mess into a chart. There is another quiet detail about breathing under high G. If blood pressure in the head drops, your respiratory control can change. You might breathe faster without meaning to, or you might breathe shallow because deep breaths are expensive. Either way, carbon dioxide can drift upward. Carbon dioxide is not just waste, it affects blood vessel diameter in the brain. High carbon dioxide tends to dilate cerebral vessels, which can help flow. Low carbon dioxide from overbreathing can constrict them, which can worsen symptoms. So a panicked breathing pattern can make you pass out sooner. Not because fear is shameful, but because chemistry is indifferent. This is why calm technique beats heroic effort. Instructors eventually taught pilots to breathe in a controlled rhythm under G, not just to stay calm emotionally, to keep carbon dioxide and oxygen in a useful balance. Again, it is not poetry, it is gas exchange and vessel tone. You are not meditating. You are managing partial pressures like a damp, complicated engine. And the early researchers learned these lessons while watching people struggle in the chair. They watched faces change color. They watched speech slow. They watched hands fail to reach controls. They listened to breathing shift from normal to strained, as if someone slowly tightened a belt around the chest. If they were careful, they could stop the run before loss of consciousness. If they wanted to map the limit, they could push into it with medical oversight and a stopwatch. That is the uncomfortable reality. Sometimes the experiment required you to fail, because failure is where the boundary is drawn. The lab is full of boundaries. Maximum safe G exposure, maximum duration, minimum vision threshold, recovery time expectations. These boundaries become rules later, written in training manuals. But tonight, they are being written in you. There is a moment after a hard run when the centrifuge slows to a stop. The arm coasts down, and your inner ear tries to catch up. You might feel as if the room is still moving, even when it is not. Your blood redistributes again, settling back into familiar geometry. Your legs regain their normal ownership. Your vision is crisp again, and that crispness feels like a luxury. A technician opens the harness, and your body resists standing. Not because you are weak, but because your vessels are still recalibrating. Standing too fast can make you lightheaded, even in normal gravity. After high G, the whole system is more confused, so they guide you patiently, because falling over would be embarrassing paperwork. This is the other side of high G research. It is not only about what happens at peak load, it is about recovery and after effects and how long it takes to be useful again. In combat flight, you do not get a break after a turn. You might need to pull again and again in quick sequence. So they studied repeated exposures, how tolerance changes with fatigue, how technique degrades, how heart rate stays elevated, how quickly vision symptoms return if you do not fully recover. The body is not a switch. It is a slow system, and slow systems hate being pushed rapidly. All of this brings us back to a simple, ordinary truth. Breathing under an invisible weight is not a metaphor. It is a mechanical problem. Your lungs do not inflate on their own. They are pulled open by muscle against pressure and weight. Under high G, the weight of the chest wall and abdominal contents changes the workload. The muscles tire, and when muscles tire, breathing becomes smaller. When breathing becomes smaller, oxygen delivery can drop. And when oxygen delivery drops, the brain becomes less helpful. That is why the lab voice always sounded calm. Panic wastes oxygen, and oxygen is what you are trading. The calm voice is not kindness. It is efficiency. And efficiency in this room is the closest thing to mercy. Speaking of efficiency, there is a particular efficiency in how the body gives up. It does not collapse randomly. It collapses in a sequence that can be predicted and sometimes delayed. So the next phase of your education in this chair is learning the awkward art of not passing out. Not by wishing, not by bravery, by timing, tension, and a refusal to let blood settle where it wants. You will be told to brace before the G hits, because once the dimming starts, you are already behind. You will be told to keep your chin in a certain position, because neck posture affects blood vessels, and because a heavy head can kink its own supply lines. You will be told to keep your legs engaged, not limp, because limp legs are reservoirs, and reservoirs are where your consciousness goes to die. Early test subjects did not get sleek training programs. They got trial and error. They got bruises from harnesses, sore muscles from straining, and a growing respect for how fragile alertness is. They learned that the strain maneuver is not just flexing, it is coordinated. You tighten the lower body, hold the pressure, then release slightly, then tighten again. You breathe in short cycles, forced exhalations that keep thoracic pressure up. The rhythm becomes a metronome in your skull. Not too fast, or you hyperventilate. Not too slow, or pressure collapses between cycles. In later years, this became formalized. Formalized meant someone finally admitted on paper that the grunting had a purpose. Formalized meant checklists and instructors, and a name that sounded respectable enough for a briefing room. The anti-G straining maneuver became a practiced pattern, not a lucky accident. You do not just clench, you sequence the clench. You do not just breathe, you weaponize breathing against your own circulation. In the centrifuge, they can hear the rhythm through your microphone. They can tell when you are doing it right and when fatigue makes you sloppy, because sloppy sounds like panic, and panic sounds like quick, thin breaths that steal your own advantage. One of the first lessons is that the maneuver starts before the load peaks. If you wait for the gray curtain, you are already behind the machine. So you learn to anticipate. You tense the legs early, like bracing for a wave you cannot see. You keep your glottis tight during short exhalations to keep pressure in the chest. That chest pressure helps keep blood pressure near the heart, and the heart, relieved of a little burden, keeps feeding the brain. You are doing plumbing with muscle and timing. This is the awkward art. Not passing out is less about heroics and more about refusing to let blood become a lazy puddle. In the early years, they did not always know which details mattered. So they tried everything that sounded plausible and measured what happened. They adjusted seat angles, sometimes by a few degrees at a time. They changed footrest positions to see if leg posture affected pooling. They experimented with different harness tensions because a tight strap can also compress vessels. They tried head support shapes because a heavy head can become a kinked hose. You would not think your neck matters until it does. If your chin drops, the muscles and soft tissue can press on vessels. If your head twists under load, the strain can make you tense wrong. And under high G, wrong is not dramatic. It is simply shorter time to tunnel vision, shorter time to the blank, polite, dark. The anti-G suit joins the conversation here like an extra set of hands on your legs. The suit inflates when G rises, using air pressure pulled from the aircraft system in real flight. In the centrifuge, it is controlled by valves and a schedule. The bladders squeeze your calves, thighs, and abdomen. This reduces the capacity of the veins down there to hold blood. Veins are compliant, meaning they expand easily. Under load, that expansion becomes a trap for your circulation. The suit makes the trap smaller. It is not elegant. It is a pressure hug you never asked for. But it buys you something precious, which is blood where it belongs. The early suits were a kind of wearable compromise. They were heavy, sweaty, and prone to pinching where you least want attention. They could bruise the skin and leave patterned marks, like an argument with furniture. Some restricted movement so much that reaching controls became awkward. So the suit keeps you awake, and then your hands cannot do the job. Congratulations, you are now a conscious passenger in your own cockpit. That problem pushed design forward slowly and irritably. Better tailoring, better pressure regulation, so the squeeze matched the G more smoothly. And eventually, better integration with oxygen systems, because breathing and blood are a paired problem. If you are breathing thin air, the blood you do deliver carries less oxygen. So oxygen systems matter, even when the main issue is circulation. In high-performance flight, pilots often use positive pressure breathing. That means the system pushes air into the lungs under pressure. It is not like normal breathing, which is mostly suction. It feels like the mask is insisting, like an overly involved roommate. But that pressure can help in two ways. It supports ventilation when the chest is heavy, and it can increase pressure inside the chest, which can help maintain blood pressure. Of course, it also makes exhalation harder. So now breathing is a tug-of-war in both directions. Early researchers had to learn what pressures helped and what pressures exhausted you. Because exhaustion is another quiet failure mode. The body does not always quit suddenly. Sometimes it just runs out of budget. In the centrifuge, you learn to recognize fatigue in your own technique. Your leg squeeze becomes less complete. Your timing slips, so you strain after the G peak instead of before it. Your breaths become uneven because the diaphragm is tired. And the moment you get uneven, the gray edges creep back. The machine is not cruel. It is consistent. It responds to your inconsistency like a scale responding to extra weight. To the observers, it looks like a clean curve on a graph. To you, it feels like your body is negotiating with an invisible hand. In the early days, some subjects were trained pilots, already familiar with G in a turn. Others were not, which made their reports strangely valuable. A pilot might push through symptoms out of habit. A student might describe them with fresh honesty. The lab needed both. It needed the seasoned tolerance and the untrained baseline, because aviation medicine was building rules that had to apply to real people, not just the toughest ones in the room. There was also the question of direction. High G is not one thing. It depends on where the force points through the body. The most notorious is head to foot, which drains blood away from the brain. But there is also chest to back, which is more tolerable. That is why astronauts recline during launch and reentry. They are aligning their body so the acceleration spreads more evenly. In a reclined position, the blood does not have to climb as far, so the brain stays fed longer. You could call it a trick, or you could call it the best available surrender. Even in the centrifuge, they could change how the force acted on you. Different orientations, different seat backs, different angles of the arm. Each produced different symptoms. Head to foot loads stole vision fastest. Chest to back loads felt like being pushed into a mattress by a firm hand. Still heavy, still tiring, but less likely to steal consciousness quickly. So, the map of human tolerance became a map with arrows. Not just how much, but which way. Then there is the timing profile, the shape of the G over time. A sudden onset feels different from a gradual rise. With gradual rise, the reflexes have time to adjust. Vessels constrict, heart rate increases, technique settles in. With sudden onset, you can be behind before you know you are late. In real flight, some maneuvers create rapid onset. A sharp pull can slam you into a higher load quickly. So, the centrifuge learned to mimic those shapes too. Smooth ramps for endurance studies, sharp spikes for surprise and response. Your body prefers warning. Physics does not promise warning. Another detail that mattered is the pressure inside your suit, and even your abdominal pressure. Your abdomen is not just a container of organs. It is a reservoir that can hold blood. Compressing the abdomen can help push venous blood back toward the heart. That is why anti-G suits often include abdominal bladders. But abdominal compression changes breathing mechanics. Press too hard and you cannot expand your lungs easily. So you trade one advantage for another cost. That trade is the theme of this whole room. Every fix has a price. Every adaptation shifts strain somewhere else. And the body keeps a ledger. Early researchers were also forced to care about something unromantic called repeatability. If you run the centrifuge on Monday and again on Wednesday, do you get the same result? Sometimes you do not. Hydration changes blood volume. Heat changes vessel tone. Stress changes hormone levels. Even a mild cold can change your airway resistance and breathing. So the lab becomes picky about conditions. They start telling you what to eat and when. They tell you to avoid caffeine sometimes, or to keep it consistent. They weigh you, not for vanity, but for fluid shifts and suit fit. They take your blood pressure and your resting heart rate. They want your baseline, because the baseline predicts how you fall apart. There is a small cruelty in baselines. A baseline is the lab saying, "This is your normal, and we will now push you away from it." You sit in the chair again because one run is not enough data, and you realize something quietly unsettling. Your body remembers. Not consciously, perhaps, but there is a learned tension that arrives early. Your muscles begin to brace before the machine asks. Your breathing changes before the load rises. This can help, or it can hurt. If you tense too soon, you fatigue before the peak. If you anticipate correctly, you last longer. So even anticipation becomes something they study. The mind is not separate from the blood. The mind changes how you breathe and how you strain. It changes when you admit symptoms. It changes whether you try to be tough or try to be accurate. And accuracy is what the clipboard wants. Because the clipboard is building a world where people do not die from predictable physiology. If you listen closely, the entire field of high G research is basically one question. How do you keep blood in the head when the universe wants it in the feet? There are only so many answers. Change posture, add external pressure, train muscle strain, support breathing, limit exposure. Design the vehicle to avoid asking impossible things. And that last one is the quiet triumph. A lot of progress is simply choosing not to demand the worst. But humans love demanding the worst, so the lab keeps spinning. There is also the question of what happens when you do lose consciousness, not as a moral failure, as a physiological event with a timeline. In centrifuge studies, when someone goes out, they often come back quickly once the load drops. But the return is not always clean. There can be a brief period of confusion. Some describe dreamlike fragments. Some have involuntary movements, like brief convulsions, not because they are having a seizure in the medical sense necessarily, because the brain, deprived, does strange things when it reboots. The clinical term people use is convulsive syncope. Syncope means fainting, which is a gentle word. Convulsive means the body may jerk, which is less gentle. To an observer, it can look alarming. To the subject, it is often missing time. A gap, then awareness returning like a light flickering back on. And that gap is why the lab treats loss of consciousness as serious. Not because it is always harmful in the chair, but because in flight, even a few seconds can be fatal. An aircraft at high speed covers an obscene distance in a short blackout. Altitude is spent while you are away. The plane keeps obeying its last input, which might be a turn that tightens. So the lab watches closely and stops runs before it goes that far, when possible. Yet early studies did sometimes push to find the boundary, because boundaries are not found by staying safely inside them. That is the part people rarely romanticize in textbooks. Human tolerance limits were discovered by letting humans approach them, slowly, with supervision, and with someone ready to stop the machine. It was controlled risk, but it was still risk. And it leaves a particular mood in the room. Not fear exactly, more like professional seriousness. Because everyone in there understands the same thing. You cannot argue with blood flow. You can only manage it. The management becomes more refined as the years pass. You get better suits. You get better training. You get better seat design. You get improved oxygen delivery systems. You get better rules about maximum sustained loads. But the core sensation remains stubbornly primitive. Heavy chest, heavy limbs, narrowing world. A brain that begins to conserve quietly and efficiently. And because the lab is interested in function, not just survival, they test tasks. They ask you to track a moving target with a joystick. They ask you to respond to lights and tones. They ask you to read numbers in sequence. They ask you to do simple arithmetic. They are probing the edge where you are still awake but no longer competent. Competence is the real requirement in flight. A conscious pilot who cannot process information is still a problem. So the lab learns to distinguish between awareness and performance. You can be awake and still be behind. Your reaction times lengthen. Your fine motor control becomes clumsy. Your attention narrows so you miss peripheral cues. And in a cockpit, peripheral cues can be the difference between stable and stall. This is why high-G training includes more than just staying conscious. It includes learning to keep doing tasks while under load. You are not just saving your brain, you are trying to keep your hands useful. Which is difficult, because under high G, your arms are heavy too. Reaching for a switch feels like lifting a suitcase that is bolted to your shoulder. So aircraft designers begin to move controls slowly toward places you can reach under load. They cluster vital switches, they shape stick forces, they design grips for gloved hands and tired muscles. Because you, the human, are not a passive component. You are the limiting factor. And that is a strange kind of power. Your weakness shapes machines. Your fainting threshold becomes a design constraint. Your blood volume becomes an engineering parameter. Your need for oxygen and visibility becomes part of what an aircraft can demand. The centrifuge room is where those demands become negotiable. Now, after enough runs, you start to understand the rhythm of the place. Spin up, hold, task, report, spin down, recover, repeat. It is clinical, yes, but it is also intimate because there is no hiding from what you feel in your own body. The lab can measure heart rate and blood pressure and oxygen saturation. But the first hint often comes from your voice. A slight change in cadence, a pause before a number, a word that arrives wrong. You become your own warning system if you learn to pay attention. In later training, pilots are taught to recognize those personal cues. Some feel facial tingling. Some feel heat in the legs. Some notice that their inner monologue becomes pleasantly slow. That pleasant slowness is a trap. The body does not always scream when it is failing. Sometimes it whispers and asks you to nap. Congratulations, your brain has discovered the softest way to betray you. This brings us to something quietly psychological. Being tested in early high-G research was not only physical discomfort, it was also the experience of being watched while you degrade. Your heart rate displayed on a screen, your voice recorded, your performance scored, timestamps marking your confusion like a metronome. And there is a particular loneliness in that, because even if the technicians are kind, they are still observing, they are still collecting, they are still turning your moment into a line of ink. They might ask you afterward to describe what it felt like, not for sympathy, for documentation. They want the subjective report to match the objective signals, because if they align, prediction improves. If they do not align, the lab gets nervous. Misalignment means someone could be failing without noticing. That is the nightmare scenario in a cockpit. So your feelings become data too, even the words you choose. Curtain, tunnel, sparkles, heavy tongue, thick eyelids. These phrases end up in reports. In some sense, you are donating metaphors to science. And those metaphors become training language. Later, a young pilot learns about the gray curtain because you once used that phrase. The lab also learns about the recovery period, the aftertaste of high G. When the run ends, there is often a flushed warmth as blood redistributes. Sometimes a mild headache, sometimes a shaky feeling in the legs, not from fear, from vascular adjustments. The vessels that clamped down do not immediately relax perfectly. The autonomic nervous system, the automatic wiring, is still on alert, so your heart rate stays up. Your hands might tremble slightly, your mouth might be dry, and the room, which never changes temperature for your comfort, feels a little too cold because you have been sweating into a suit that does not breathe well. Sweat matters too. It reduces fluid volume. Reduced fluid volume lowers your tolerance next time. So, the lab begins to care about hydration as a variable. Drink water, maintain blood volume, avoid starting a run slightly dehydrated. Because the simplest improvements are often the least glamorous. A glass of water can be worth more than a new strap. The body is that annoyingly practical. As the decades move, the centrifuge studies begin to connect with real flight experience more tightly. Pilots report symptoms during maneuvers. Medical teams compare them with centrifuge profiles. They adjust training accordingly. They adjust suit pressures. They adjust oxygen delivery schedules. The lab becomes less of a curiosity and more of an industry, because aircraft are now capable of sustaining higher loads longer. And the human has not evolved fast enough to keep up. Humans are still built for walking, carrying, and occasionally running away, not for sustained, tight turns at high speed. So the lab keeps asking the same question, with better instruments. How do you keep the brain awake and useful? One answer that emerges slowly is that the brain does not just need oxygen, it needs perfusion pressure. Pressure is what drives flow through the brain. If the pressure drops, the brain cannot simply extract more oxygen. It is not a sponge with infinite efficiency. It needs a stream. So the anti-G system is ultimately a pressure maintenance system. That is why the baroreceptor reflex matters so much. Baroreceptors are stretch sensors in the arteries, especially in the carotid sinus and aortic arch. They detect pressure changes and adjust heart rate and vessel tone. Under high G, the pressure at the carotids can drop, even if pressure elsewhere is high. So the reflex fires hard, but if the drop is too severe, the reflex cannot compensate enough. And then vision goes first, because vision is expensive. The lab can even see hints of this with monitoring. They might measure arterial pressure in some studies. They might track electrocardiogram rhythms to see cardiac response. They might watch for arrhythmias because extreme strain can provoke them in susceptible people. So screening becomes part of the story. Not everyone is a good candidate for being spun like this, and early research did not always have the screening standards we expect now. In some early programs, you would show up with a pulse, and that was considered enough paperwork. You would sign a form that mostly protected the institution, not your dignity. You would sit down, and the staff would take your blood pressure once, like a superstition. And then they would spin you anyway, because urgency is a kind of anesthesia. High acceleration research grew out of war, and out of faster aircraft, and out of the realization that pilots were fainting mid-turn. So, the early logic was blunt. If people are going to black out in the sky, you would rather watch them black out on the ground. The problem, of course, is that the ground has its own talent for cruelty. A centrifuge can be controlled, but it can also be pushed with confidence. And confidence is dangerous when the subject is a wet brain in a bony box. You are strapped in, and you begin to notice how much of medicine is just careful watching. A technician looks at your face, not just the monitor, because your face changes first in ways the sensors do not always capture. Your lips pale, your skin mottles, your eyes get that distant shine. There is a particular look you develop right before the world narrows. It is not fear, it is absence, arriving early. Some labs tried to measure everything they could because measurement feels like control. They used electrocardiograms and blood pressure cuffs and sometimes arterial lines in more invasive studies. They measured breathing and sometimes brain activity, though that was harder in a spinning machine. They even looked at the eyes directly, using cameras and mirrors. Because if your vision is the first system to complain, your eyes are the loudest witness. The trouble is, the body is not consistent in the way machines are consistent. You can run the same person twice and get two different performances. Your hydration changes, your stress changes, even the temperature in the room changes how your blood vessels behave. So the lab learns to treat you like a complicated variable. They start controlling your schedule. They tell you when to eat and what to avoid. They insist you show up rested, which is charming optimism, and then they spin you and pretend they are studying gravity instead of biology. One quiet shift happens as the field matures. The focus moves from dramatic blackout events to the boring edge just before it. Because that edge is where pilots actually live. A pilot does not always go fully unconscious. More often, the pilot gets sluggish, tunneled, and subtly incompetent. That state has a name that sounds like polite bureaucracy, almost loss of consciousness. It is the human equivalent of a computer running, but dropping frames. Your inputs still happen, but late. Your decisions still form, but simplistic. Your confidence stays high because the brain loves a lie that saves effort. So the centrifuge becomes a place where they train you not just to stay awake, they train you to stay useful. They give you tasks while the load rises. They make you track a moving target on a screen. They make you respond to lights and tones and little prompts. Because flying is not just remaining conscious, flying is remaining competent while your circulation is being dragged downward. You discover another unromantic truth. Your hands are not special. Under high G, your arms get heavy and your fine motor control gets clumsy. Switches that are easy on the ground become weirdly distant in the air. Your fingers feel thick, like you are wearing invisible gloves. So cockpit design begins to shift in response. Important controls migrate closer. Grip shapes get refined. Force requirements change because strength is not the limiting factor anymore. The limiting factor is effort under load. A few pounds of extra force on a stick can become impossible when your arm weighs 3 times more than usual. And then there is the neck, the quiet victim of high acceleration. In the centrifuge, your head is heavy and your neck must hold it steady. In real flight, the situation gets worse because pilots also wear helmets. Sometimes they wear night vision devices, which add weight in the worst place, out front. So now, under high G, your neck is fighting a lever arm. Muscle strain, vertebrae compress, and fatigue builds fast. It is not dramatic in the moment. It is a dull burn, a stubborn ache, but it matters because pain steals attention, and attention is already on rationing. You can hear the irony in the research discussions later. They wanted to know how many G a human could tolerate, and they learned that even if your brain can stay perfused, your body still has to operate. A pilot who can see but cannot turn their head is not exactly winning. So high G tolerance becomes a system problem. Circulation, breathing, posture, suit fit, muscle endurance, cockpit ergonomics, even training psychology, because panic changes breathing, and breathing changes blood flow. The lab begins to look less like a carnival ride and more like an unpleasant rehearsal for real air combat. And you, strapped into the seat, become a rehearsal space. There is another detail that researchers learned through repeated discomfort. The onset rate matters more than your pride wants it to. A slow rise in G gives your body time to clamp down vessels and engage reflexes. A fast onset catches you mid-breath, mid-thought, mid-blink. In fast jets, onset can be sharp. You pull hard, and the load stacks instantly. So, training evolves toward preloading. You do not wait to strain. You strain as you pull, as if you are anticipating an insult, because you are. The aircraft is insulting your circulatory system repeatedly, with enthusiasm. And in the centrifuge, they practice that timing again and again. They listen to your breathing and your cadence. They teach you to make it automatic, because under stress, you cannot afford to remember instructions. You can only perform habits. Some of the early work also stumbled into an awkward corner of ethics. When you push a person to the edge of consciousness, you are not just measuring physiology, you are testing consent in a very thin state. A subject might say they are fine, right up until they are not capable of meaningful speech. A subject might continue because quitting feels like failure, and the lab staff, hungry for clean limits, might let the run continue longer than comfort would advise. This is why later protocols become stricter. Stop criteria, clear thresholds. Observers train to recognize the blank stare that arrives before the slump, because you cannot rely on the subject to self-report at the edge. The edge is where self-report becomes unreliable. Congratulations, your very ability to say stop is one of the first things to degrade. So the lab learns to stop you, sometimes before you would stop yourself, not out of kindness alone, out of respect for the data and for the institution's future reputation. Now the strange part is that all this grim knowledge did not stay in the centrifuge room. It left the building on clipboards, then on training syllabi, then on pilot check rides, and eventually it left on actual missions, where high acceleration was not a test. It was a Tuesday. That transition is quiet, but it is the real story. From spin rooms to real flight, where the airframe is not a controlled environment. In an aircraft, you have vibration, noise, heat, sweat, and the constant need to keep situational awareness. The centrifuge gives you a clean kind of suffering. Real flight gives you suffering with distractions, and distractions are where accidents breed. In a fighter jet, high G usually arrives during maneuvering. A tight turn, a sudden pull-up, a defensive brake. The acceleration is often along the head-to-foot axis, the one that trains your brain. Pilots call it pulling G. like you are hauling on a rope. But what you are really doing is ordering your blood to climb a hill it does not want. The first few seconds can feel manageable because the reflexes kick in, heart rate rises, vessels constrict, your strain maneuver starts. But if you hold it, fatigue creeps in, not the romantic fatigue of a hero, the boring fatigue of muscle fibers running out of patience. Your legs burn from staying clenched. Your abdomen aches from repeated bracing. Your breathing pattern becomes work, not rhythm. And the moment your rhythm slips, the edges of vision start that polite fade again. In real flight, the fade is more treacherous because the world is moving fast. A tunnel of vision means you miss the horizon. You miss the other aircraft. You miss warning lights. You might even miss the sense that you are losing control. The aircraft does not slow down to match your narrowing perception. So fighter training becomes partly about managing your own biology, like it is a subsystem. The pilot is taught to monitor their internal state with the same seriousness as fuel pressure, because the fuel system does not care how tough you feel. Neither does your carotid pressure. Pilots learn to recognize their own early cues. Some feel facial warmth. Some feel that distant calm again, that gentle betrayal. Some notice that their hands feel clumsy. Some notice that sound feels slightly muffled, not from ears, but from attention shrinking. The training emphasizes that these cues are not shame, they are instrumentation. If you get a warning light, you do not argue with it, you respond. In aircraft, response can mean easing the pull, changing the maneuver, or committing to a faster, stronger strain. It can also mean using the aircraft's own systems better. Anti-G suits in real jets are connected to the aircraft. As the G increases, valves open and air inflates the bladders. The squeeze is timed to the load, so the suit becomes a kind of mechanical partner. Not gentle, just useful. In modern systems, there is also positive pressure breathing, especially at higher G levels. The mask pushes air in under pressure. It feels unnatural, like the air is impatient, but that pressure supports ventilation and can raise thoracic pressure, which can help maintain blood pressure. Again, every advantage has a cost. Positive pressure breathing can make speech harder. It can make exhalation feel like pushing against a stubborn door. It can increase fatigue because now breathing muscles are fighting both gravity and pressure. So training includes learning to talk, breathe, and strain through equipment that treats you like a reluctant bellows. And then the aircraft design itself starts adapting. Seats recline more in some high-performance jets. Reclining reduces the vertical distance from heart to brain, effectively lowering the hill. It also changes how your spine loads under G, which can reduce some injury risk. But it introduces trade-offs too. Reclined seats can change visibility out of the cockpit. They can make entry and exit harder. They can complicate ejection because geometry matters when you are being fired out of a plane. So designers negotiate. They trade a few degrees of recline for a few % of tolerance. They trade visibility for consciousness. It is all compromise, written in angles and straps. Real flight also introduces vibration and head movement. In a centrifuge, your head can be supported and the environment is stable. In a jet, you might need to look over your shoulder during a turn. That head turn under high G can be brutal. You are moving a heavy object, your helmeted head, against the load. And when you turn, you can momentarily change blood flow patterns in the neck. It is not usually the main cause of G-induced loss of consciousness, but it can contribute. It can also cause strain and injury, especially after repeated high G sorties. Pilots sometimes develop chronic neck pain, a souvenir from years of asking muscles to be cranes. So even as G tolerance improves, the body collects wear. Staying conscious is not the same as being unharmed. There is also the issue of repeated exposures in a single flight. A dogfight or aggressive maneuvering is not one clean pull. It is pull, relax, pull again, sometimes with little recovery. Your circulation never fully resets. Your muscles never fully unclench. Your breathing stays elevated, so fatigue accumulates and your tolerance can drop over the course of minutes. The lab learned this in repeated runs. Pilots learn it in the air, where the lesson is more expensive. That is why operational limits are not just about peak G. They include duration. They include repetition. They include how long you can sustain a load before performance collapses. There is a reason pilots do not simply pull maximum all the time. They are not being polite. They are avoiding becoming blind and ineffective while still very much awake. Aviation medicine also learned to care about something called G awareness. Not mystical awareness, just the ability to sense G onset and respond immediately with proper technique. Some pilots are naturally better at it. Some learn through hard experience. The centrifuge became part of training for that reason. It lets you practice the maneuver without risking an airframe. It lets instructors see your technique and correct it. It lets you fail safely, which is a rare privilege in aviation. And you can feel the cynical truth under it all. The centrifuge is not there to prove you are brave. It is there to make your failures predictable and therefore manageable. Designers also built in warnings. Some systems monitor parameters and can alert pilots to impending issues, but the human body is still the main sensor. Your eyes are the first. Your breathing rhythm is the second. Your cognitive narrowing is the third, though you rarely notice it in time. So the best defense is still technique, plus equipment, plus not asking for the impossible. And that last part, not asking for the impossible, becomes a design philosophy. Modern fly-by-wire aircraft can include G limiters, software that prevents the pilot from exceeding certain loads. It is not because engineers distrust pilots. It is because physics is indifferent, and the human is fragile, and lawsuits are tedious. So the machine protects the human, partly for mission success, partly for institutional sanity. Now, the story keeps expanding because flight does not stop at the atmosphere. Once you start throwing people towards space, acceleration becomes part of launch and return. And the direction of acceleration changes, and the durations change, and the psychological context changes too. In a fighter, you pull G while actively controlling the aircraft. In a rocket, you are mostly strapped in, along for the ride, while the vehicle does the work. That passivity can be strangely unsettling. Your technique options shrink. Your ability to change the profile is basically zero. So the engineering must handle what your muscles cannot. Rocket launches tend to produce sustained acceleration that builds, rather than violent spikes. You feel it as a steady increase in weight, pressing you into your seat. If you are reclined, the acceleration is more chest to back. That is more tolerable than head to foot. You can endure more that way because blood is not being dragged away from the brain as aggressively. Instead, it is being pressed into your back and your lungs and your ribs. It feels like a firm, patient hand, keeping you pinned, not crushing, just insisting. Breathing becomes heavier because your chest wall is loaded, but your vision is less likely to disappear in that classic tunnel pattern. You still get fatigue and you still get discomfort, but the failure mode is different. Space agencies learned early that comfort is not luxury, it is performance insurance. A panicking astronaut wastes oxygen, wastes attention, and makes errors. So procedures become calm, repetitive, and almost boring on purpose. Checklists are not just for correctness, they are for emotional pacing. You read a line, you respond, you move on. It keeps the mind from spiraling while the vehicle does something violent outside the window. During launch, you might feel vibration through the seat, a shiver of machinery pushing against the planet. The noise is not silence and awe, it is roar and rattling, filtered through structure. Your body is pressed back, your arms feel heavier, your face feels slightly distorted by the load. It is not as extreme in many profiles as the worst fighter maneuvering, but it is sustained and you cannot stop it. So you become very interested in small comforts, padding, helmet support, how the straps distribute force across your hips and shoulders, because a small pressure point becomes a big pain when multiplied by time and acceleration. Reentry brings its own version of heaviness. Now you are returning into atmosphere, and the vehicle is shedding speed by slamming into air. Heat builds outside, but inside you feel deceleration as another kind of weight. Again, reclined posture helps. Again, breathing becomes work. And again, the body's main complaint is not drama. It is mechanics. Your chest must lift under load. Your diaphragm must move against heavier organs. Your neck must keep the head aligned, despite vibration and suit bulk. Spacesuits complicate everything because they are pressurized environments. A suit is basically a personal balloon with joints. It keeps you alive and it makes movement stiff and awkward. Under acceleration, the suit can press in strange ways. Connections tug. The helmet ring becomes a hard boundary around your shoulders. The gloves fight you. So astronauts train in suits because surprise stiffness is how you burn energy. And panic, as you have learned, is metabolically expensive. Another subtle detail is that acceleration changes how fluids sit in your body. Under sustained chest-to-back G, blood can shift toward the back tissues. It is less likely to drain from the brain completely, but it still changes sensation. Some people feel facial fullness, some feel pressure in the chest, some feel that their breathing is oddly shallow because deep breaths are resisted by the load. So oxygen delivery systems and suit ventilation become critical, not because oxygen is absent, but because comfort maintains function. Space medicine, in a cynical way, becomes the study of keeping humans calm enough to do tasks while being treated like cargo. And that cargo mindset is not just metaphor. Early spaceflight, especially, was built around the idea that the astronaut would mostly endure. The vehicle was experimental. The physiology was uncertain, so they leaned heavily on the earlier acceleration work, centrifuge studies, aircraft studies, animal flights, all building a picture of tolerance. What the heart does under load, what breathing does, what cognition does when stressed. Because in spaceflight, cognitive errors can be as deadly as fainting. A wrong switch, a missed cue, a delayed response. These are small mistakes with large consequences. So the culture around spaceflight became methodical. Calm voices, slow call-outs, redundant checks. It is not romance. It is survival through boredom. Now, after you survive launch and re-entry in your imagination, the story does something odd. It flips from heavy, crushing force to the strange mercy of almost none at all. You expect weightlessness to feel like rest, but your body does not interpret it as a vacation. It interprets it as a paperwork error, because every fluid in you was trained for your whole life to settle downward. Now there is no downward. So the fluids do what they always do when rules disappear. They wander. In the first hours of microgravity, blood and other fluids drift upward toward your chest and head. Not dramatically, not like a fountain, more like a slow crowd at a concert, pressing toward the front. Your face puffs slightly. Your eyelids feel fuller. Your nose gets stuffy, as if you have a mild cold in a perfectly sterile machine. Astronauts call it puffy face, bird legs, because the legs lose some fluid volume and the head gains it. Your legs look thinner, even though you did not do anything heroic. Congratulations, you have achieved a cosmetic effect by simply falling forever. You might think that extra blood in the head would make you feel sharp, but your body is not impressed. Sensors in your blood vessels register the shift and decide you have too much volume, so you start peeing out fluid in the first day or two. That is not a joke, it is a reflex. Your kidneys get a signal that the central circulation is overfilled. They respond by reducing plasma volume. Less fluid means less mass to manage, and on Earth, that can be fine. In space, it is the beginning of a long, quiet problem. Because later, when you come home to normal gravity, you will want that blood volume back, and you will not have it yet. So you float there, feeling light, while your body quietly shrinks its own circulating supply. Then you try to sleep, and you learn that weightlessness is not automatically comfortable. On Earth, gravity helps you settle into a bed. In microgravity, you do not settle into anything. You just hover, gently insisting on being in the wrong place. Your arms want to drift upward. Your knees want to rise. Your head wants to bump into whatever you forgot was behind you. So you get strapped into a sleeping bag, attached to a wall. A wall that is also a ceiling, that is also just a surface. With Velcro, your brain can adapt, but it takes time. Some astronauts report that the first nights feel like trying to sleep while someone keeps nudging you. Not with a hand, with physics. There is also sound. The movies sell you silence. Real spacecraft sell you fans. Ventilation fans, pump fans, electronics cooling, life support, moving air in loops. Because in microgravity, warm air does not rise. Exhaled CO2 does not politely drift away. It can pool near your face if airflow is poor. So the spacecraft keeps the air moving constantly, a steady, mechanical hush that never turns off. It is less like camping in space and more like sleeping next to an impatient refrigerator. You might also notice that your sense of up and down becomes negotiable. Your inner ear is built around gravity and acceleration. In microgravity, the otolith organs, the little gravity stones in your vestibular system, stop reporting what they used to report. Your brain tries to reconcile signals that no longer match its model of the world. For some people, this produces space motion sickness, nausea without poison, dizziness without spinning. Just the brain, offended by inconsistent paperwork, it usually improves after a few days. Not because space becomes normal, but because the brain is very good at giving up and moving on. But the strangest part is what happens over weeks. Because your muscles and bones are opportunists. They only maintain themselves if you need them. On Earth, gravity is an always-on training partner. Even standing still is work for postural muscles. In orbit, those muscles get laid off. Your calves, your thighs, the muscles along your spine, they are suddenly unnecessary. And the body does not keep expensive tissue around out of sentiment. Muscle atrophy begins, not overnight, but steadily, and bone, especially in the hips and spine, begins to lose mineral density. Bone is living tissue that remodels according to load. Less load means less bone. The science term is bone resorption. The human translation is your skeleton starts economizing. This matters for two reasons. First, weakness is inconvenient during a mission. Second, the lost calcium ends up in your blood and can contribute to kidney stones. Congratulations, you have escaped Earth's gravity, and your kidneys are considering violence. So astronauts exercise a lot, not for fitness vanity, for basic maintenance, treadmills with harnesses that pull you down, to simulate body weight, stationary bikes, resistance devices that mimic weightlifting with vacuum cylinders and springs. It is strangely unromantic. You are in orbit, watching continents slide by, and you are still doing your reps because biology does not care about the view. Even your heart changes. In microgravity, the heart does not have to push blood upward against gravity. The workload can drop. Over time, the heart can slightly decondition, like any muscle that gets an easier job. And that becomes important when you return to Earth. When gravity comes back, suddenly blood wants to pool in the legs again. But now you have lower blood volume, less vascular tone, and a heart that has been living an easier life. So, some astronauts experience orthostatic intolerance after landing. That means feeling dizzy or faint when standing. Your body is relearning the old rule, downhill exists again. This is where the flip connects back to the earlier story. High G tried to steal blood from your head by force. Microgravity tries to steal your Earth readiness by removing force entirely. Different extremes. Same central theme. You are a fluid-filled system, and your brain is picky about pressure. And speaking of picky brains, there is another consequence of fluid shifting upward. Pressure inside the skull can change subtly. In recent years, some astronauts reported vision changes after long missions, blurred vision, flattening of the back of the eye, changes in the optic nerve area. This cluster of findings has been called spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. That is a long name for a simple fear. Your eyes can change shape if pressure relationships shift for months. The exact causes are still being studied, likely a mix of fluid distribution, venous drainage changes, and how the body handles pressure without gravity. It is not instant blindness. It is something quieter and therefore more annoying. A small change in focus, a need for different lenses, a reminder that your body has never rehearsed this environment. So while weightlessness looks serene, it is not rest. It is a different kind of workload, the workload of adaptation. And adaptation is expensive, even when it feels gentle. Now you drift and you realize the emotional tone of space physiology is mostly compromise. High G research built ways to keep you conscious under crushing force. Microgravity research builds ways to keep you intact under the absence of force. And all of those ways were purchased the same way, with uncomfortable days in controlled rooms, which brings you back softly to the ground, back to the people in lab coats who had to make meaning out of misery, because every modern comfort in flight was built on a very old arrangement. Someone, somewhere, was turned into a number with a pulse. Early test subjects were rarely treated like mythic heroes. They were treated like cooperative equipment. You can hear it in the language of reports. Subject reported gray out at time mark. Subject recovered after reduction of load. Subject performed task with delayed response. Whole human experiences poured into a few lines. The lab notebook does not have room for your dread. It does not have room for the taste of dry mouth or the ache behind the eyes. It certainly does not have room for the strange shame of failing in front of observers. So it writes the clean parts: time, speed, symptoms, outcome. And to be fair, the notebook is not trying to be cruel. It is trying to be useful, because usefulness is what keeps later people alive. In early high G programs, the social reality was complicated. Some subjects were military pilots, ordered or strongly encouraged. Some were scientists who volunteered, partly out of curiosity, partly out of stubborn pride. Some were students, eager, underpaid, and not fully aware of how long a few seconds can feel. And some were animals, because the ethics of the time were not gentle. The justification was always the same. If you do not learn the limits on the ground, you learn them in the air, and the air tends to be less forgiving. There is also the quieter issue of selection bias. The people who volunteer for high acceleration experiments often have unusual temperaments. They tolerate discomfort better. They are more motivated to please researchers. They may even enjoy the strange clarity of pushing limits, so the data can be skewed toward the tough and willing. And later, when that data becomes policy, it has to apply to ordinary bodies too. That is why the field slowly moved toward standardization, clear stop rules, more diverse subject pools, better screening, better informed consent, at least in principle, because the lab eventually learned that courage is not a variable you can safely assume. But physiology will still do what physiology does. So the question becomes, how do you make the procedure safer, not just the equipment? And that is where the boring details start saving lives. Hydration protocols, salt intake before exposure to expand plasma volume, temperature control because heat dilates vessels and worsens pooling, training programs that teach strain maneuvers until they are reflex, even simple education, teaching pilots to respect early symptoms instead of trying to out-macho them, because out-machoing physics is a short career. You also get better measurement. Early labs relied heavily on subjective reports and basic vital signs. Later labs bring in continuous blood pressure monitoring, better electrocardiograms, oxygen sensors, and sometimes near-infrared measures that estimate oxygenation in brain tissues. Not perfect, but more visibility. The more you can measure, the less you have to guess. And guesswork is where you accidentally hurt people. Another gift of those uncomfortable years is the concept of operational envelopes. Instead of asking how much G a human can survive, you ask how much G a human can fight in, how long, how often, with what workload, with what equipment. It stops being a single number and becomes a whole profile. Because a quick spike might be tolerable, but a long sustained load will grind you down. And because onset rate changes everything, and because head position changes things, real life is always more annoying than a simple chart. This is also where aircraft and spacecraft design quietly admit defeat. They build around you, not because they love you, but because you are expensive to replace. Seats recline, control layouts shift, displays get larger and easier to read under narrowed attention. Automation takes some tasks away from you when the machine expects you to be busy, not fainting. And safety systems step in when your biology becomes unreliable. G limiters in flight control software, auto recovery modes, warning systems, because sometimes the smartest move is letting the aircraft stop you from doing something your body cannot support. It sounds like coddling. It is really just logistics. Now, when you trace it forward into modern aerospace medicine, you see the same logic repeated. Humans are adaptable, but only within boundaries. So you design the system to keep the human inside those boundaries. You do not celebrate the boundary by slamming into it. You treat it like a fence around a cliff. But it took early subjects to show where the cliff was. And those early days had a particular bleak charm. Improvised rigs, crude suits, hard seats, less understanding of long-term effects, more willingness to treat discomfort as a fair price. Sometimes it was, sometimes it was not. The data, though, accumulated, and over time, it translated into changes that feel almost cozy now. Better restraint designs that spread pressure. Better helmet supports that reduced neck strain. Better oxygen masks that seal without bruising your face. Better suit materials that breathe a little, instead of turning you into a sweating specimen jar. Even small things, like better communication protocols, calm voices, short phrases, confirmation repeats. Not because calm is cute, because under stress, language has to be simple enough to survive. When cognition narrows, you do not want poetic instructions. You want boring ones. And boring, in aviation, is often the highest form of safety. There is a final kind of comfort that comes from knowing all this. Not inspiration, not triumph, just a quiet appreciation of how many people let science be unpleasant on their behalf. They sat in chairs that spun. They wore suits that squeezed. They grunted into microphones while their vision tried to leave the room. They let their worst moments be recorded and graphed so that later you could ride in a machine built with more respect for your circulatory system. And even if you never fly a jet, you still inherit the culture that came from this. The culture of human factors. The idea that machines should fit the human not demand the human become a machine. It shows up in safer cars, in better helmets, in medical monitoring, in training standards. All of it is the same impulse: measure the failure modes before they kill someone. And the centrifuge room, humming in the dark, was one of the places that impulse became practical. Now, imagine the sound again. That steady motor, that patient rotation, not thrilling, not musical, just constant. It is almost soothing if you forget what it is doing. And maybe that is the strangest lesson of all. Human bodies can get used to a lot if you introduce it slowly. A little more load, a little more strain, a little more training, until the impossible becomes routine. Not because you have transcended biology, because you have learned where biology bends, but there is always something else waiting beyond the bend, another environment that does not care about your comfort, another axis of acceleration, another quiet limit hiding behind a calm feeling. And once you start thinking like that, you begin to notice how many experiments are still running right now, quietly, in rooms that hum. Because the universe keeps offering new ways to stress a human body, and engineers keep responding with straps, checklists, and polite paperwork. And somewhere in that continuing loop, your attention drifts back to the simplest, most unscientific advantage you have: a motionless room, stable air, and gravity set to the familiar setting. But the story is not finished with you yet. Not when there are still other kinds of forces to talk about.